Good evening and welcome to the last scheduled talk of this season. The talks will resume again in September, but whether they'll be real life or online is anyone's guess at the moment. However, look out for the details on our website and Facebook page over the summer. So our speaker tonight is originally a Lanarkshire lad, born in Hamilton and educated at Hamilton Academy and then Glasgow University. Afterwards, John joined the Career Service and qualified as a careers advisor at Strathclyde University. He moved to Fife in 1975 and worked in various centres throughout the country and latterly as district manager for the North East, incorporating Fife, Tayside and Grampian. When Career Scotland was formed, John became the performance management coordinator for the same district before retiring in 2009. John lives in Kirkcaldy and is married to Alison. They have one daughter and one granddaughter. He is a lifelong rail enthusiast who has been collecting railway and canal literature for close on 50 years. John is a board member, booking clerk and archivist for the Fife Heritage Railway that's based in Leven, of course. He claims to play golf badly and has also been known to exercise his vocal cords with the Beneke Community Choir. Additionally, John is a member of Raith Probus Club and was their president in 2014-15. So I'm going to give you John Hamilton. So over to you, John.
Thank you very much. And good evening to ladies and gentlemen who I can't see, but who I'm assured are there. My talk tonight is called Railways Before Railways, and I thought I would begin by explaining to you how that came about. It came about because of a book called Bizarre Books, and it has all sorts of titles, more or less funny, of books that were published with really arcane subjects. And I was looking through it recently, and one of the books that they mentioned was called Railway Literature 1556 to 1830. And it was written by a chap called Peddy back in 1931. Now, I've not seen a copy, but I do know it exists. But what Bizarre Books had to say about it was it covers the interesting period in railway history before trains were invented. And I read this with, of course, a mixture of amusement and irritation, but it did make me think that perhaps people don't realise just what does constitute a railway and how it began. It certainly didn't spring into, existence fully formed. So what makes a modern railway? Firstly, you need specialised track. You need to be able to accommodate public traffic. You have the ability to convey passengers, although you may not do so. You need some form of mechanical traction and some measure of public control. So how did all that come about? As I say, the first modern railway is generally regarded as being the Liverpool and Manchester Railway of 1830, but it didn't spring into existence fully formed. So let's go back a long way and have a look at what might be construed as railways before the year 1600. Going back a lot further than that, this is Pompeii. Now, okay, not much to do with railways, you might say, but if you look at it, there are tracks laid in the street to guide the chariots, the carts, whatever was using them, and that does give a measure of control. It also means that there were almost certainly a standard gauge for the wagons so that they would pass along these tracks, and that gauge was around about 5 feet, which corresponds very closely to the standard railway gauge nowadays. And it's said that that 5 foot width was in fact the optimum width that a horse could pull a cart or chariot. Any wider and it was too tough for it, any narrower and energy was being wasted. So there is a timeline going back right to Roman times here. More interestingly, or more newer, are these Maltese rutways. Now, I don't know if you're aware of these, but there are quite large systems of rutways in Malta. In fact, if you look at a tourist map of Malta, the biggest site is marked as Clapham Junction. And these are rutways and nobody knows how or why they're there. It's not even clear whether they were made by the wagons or whether they were made for the wagons. And there's a lot of discussion about that. The rock is fairly soft, so it is conceivable that the use of wagons did actually cut these rutways. But even then, nobody knows what the wagons carried and why they were there. Here's a rutway, or a rather retouched picture of a wagon rutway in Syracuse, taken about, just over 100 years ago. And these rutways did exist and may still sometimes exist in various parts of the world. In Britain, here's an interesting example. There's a place called Haytor on Dartmoor, and there was a granite quarry there, which took granite down to the local canal for transshipment. So what more obvious to make the rails from than granite itself? And they built this railway or tramway with L-shaped rails, and granite being very sturdy, there's still quite a lot of it about, although the tramway closed over a couple of centuries ago. Now, this is said to be the earliest illustration of a railway-related subject in the world, and it's in fact a shot of a stained glass window in the Black Forest Cathedral in Freiburg, and it dates from around about 1350. Now, I apologise for the quality of the illustration. If you go onto the Freiburg Cathedral website, you'll find some magnificent pictures of the stained glass that they have, but unfortunately this one is not one of them. But it's said to be a miner pushing a truck. And it's probably just as well it is in a cathedral, because to believe that, you have to be looking at it with the eye of faith, do you not? Anyway, 1350 is a long time before railways. Now, moving forward 150, 170 years, here's an illustration taken from a book called Der Ursprung Gemeiner, which dates from about 1519. And if you look in the bottom right-hand corner, you will see a miner pushing a wheeled truck on what looks like some form of rail. You will also get an idea where Walt Disney probably got his ideas for the Seven Dwarfs. But the real interesting thing about this, I would say, is that this book was published in 1519. Now, printing only came to the West in the 1480s, 1490s. And yet within 20, 30 years, you were able to buy effectively the 16th century equivalent of a Haynes manual telling you how things worked. I wouldn't bother going to the library to ask if they've got a copy, because I believe there are only 6 in the world. Here's another mining illustration. This is from Cosmographiae Universalis of 1550. And left-hand side of the picture, you can see a mining truck with 4 iron wheels running on rails. And again, this illustrates the sort of work that went on. What is interesting is these pictures are all relating to Central Europe, and they all relate to mining underground. There doesn't seem to be any particular history of them using any sort of wagonway system on the surface. The most important source, though, and the one where Penny's book actually started, was a book called De Re Metallica, which was published in 1556. Now, De Re Metallica, which means all about metal or something along those lines, was written in Latin by a German called Georg Bauer, but he wrote under the name of Agricola. And if you look at this sort of left-hand side, just above the center, you can see somebody pushing a wheeled wagon out to tip ore. Now, this book, as I say, was written in Latin, and it was translated into English about the turn of the last century by an American mining engineer and his wife, which must have been a nice way to spend an evening, mustn't it? But you'll have heard of this mining engineer because his name was Herbert Hoover, and he later became US president. Any rumors that Donald Trump and his wife are doing a new version using Facebook or Twitter, I think, are unfounded, but you never know. The important thing about this book, however, is this. It illustrates the sorts of wagons that were used underground. They were called Hunds, which is German for dog. And you can see that they have 4 wheels, 2 large ones at the back and 2 small ones at the front. And they have a pin or tongue between the front wheels, which gives some element of control when the wagons are being pushed along wagonways underground. These wagons were pushed by the youngest miners, and there was a considerable amount of work needed to get all the ore out from mines using these. But the basic design is replicated throughout most of Europe. And finally, in this area, there's an illustration of the type of point work that was used. As you can see, it's very crude, and wagons must have fallen off a lot, but the tongue pointer in the middle would certainly help give them some sort of control. And then finally, there's a mining cart from Transylvania. This one dates from the early 18th century, and well, it's not a thing of beauty, is it? But it does look quite an effective piece of kit. And as you can see, there are big wooden roller type wheels with some element of flange in them to give a bit of control. Okay, that's all abroad. That's mainly in Central Europe. But what about the coming of wagonways to Britain? Well, the first thing is, there is very little actual evidence of it. Nobody wrote a history of wagonways. The evidence comes mainly from texts like wills, legal disputes, paperwork relating to, to business. And being written by lawyers, it was generally written by people who really knew very little about what they were writing about and used all sorts of terminology. So it's really quite hard to figure out at times exactly what was going on. It's likely that there were underground railway wagonways in the Lake District because German silver miners worked there in the 1570s, and it's generally assumed that they brought their technology with them. The oldest in Britain is almost certainly Broseley in Shropshire, and there is evidence that by about 1600 there were wagonways in use there. Now, Broseley is above the Severn on the other side of the bank from Coalbrookdale, and coal and ore was taken down to be shipped on the Severn. There are other possibilities. Prescott near Liverpool is possible as a wagonway, but its proof is difficult. The oldest one that is definitely known is Wallerton in Nottinghamshire, where an entrepreneur called Huntingdon Beaumont built a wagonway from a mine down to the River Trent. In Scotland, there is a possibility that there might have been some sort of wagonway in Inverest by around 1606, but quite honestly, this is probably doubtful. Move forward another 100 odd years, and you have this. This is the Causey Arch, and this is the oldest railway building in the world. It's at Tanfield in the County Durham, and it was built because by that point wagonways were springing up to carry coal from the pits of Durham and Northumberland down to the Tyne and the Wear for shipment. There was a group of coal owners in Durham called the Grand Allies, and they built a central wagonway, and this Causey Arch was on that. Now, it was only actually in use for about 25 years because the pits that it served were small, and once they were worked out, they had to go elsewhere. But the arch survived. In the 19th century, it was in ruins, but it was rebuilt, and it's still there as the oldest railway feature in the world. So if you're ever in County Durham, it's well worth a look. 1750, we've got a chap called Ralph Allen who owned a quarry near Bath, and most of the stone that built classical Bath was quarried there and brought down to Bath by a tramway, a wagonway. You can see it with the bells of Bath out to see all the fun. By the 1770s, wagonways were all over Tyneside, and here's one illustration there with the horse there ready to pull the empty wagon back up to the pit. And you can see in the background left the sort of staith where the coal was loaded into shipping to go down the Tyne. At the end of the 18th century, there was a considerable system throughout the northeast. You can see railway or wagonway tracks all over the place because the amount of mining that went on was absolutely enormous by 18th century standards. This is an interesting picture. This is said to be the most significant early railways find of this century. And it's at Willington, which is near Wallsend and Tyneside. And archaeologists uncovered this and includes in the foreground what's called a wash pond, which was an area that they flooded and set the wagons into so that the wooden wheels could be soaked and not crack. It's an amazing piece of excavation, but perhaps the most amusing thing about it all is the archaeologists who discovered it were actually looking for Roman remains. So they were only about 1500 years out, but they did go ahead and dig out, and it's really a very important site. Now in Scotland, there were wagonways from a fairly early age. This is a map showing really at the end of their life, because this is 1824, and shortly after that, railways started to be used. The hatched line going right across Scotland is the Forth and Clyde Canal and Union Canal linking the Clyde and the Forth, and you can see that there are wagonways around the Forth, wagonways around the Ayrshire coast, and some in the Monklands and areas like that in central Lanarkshire. One, for example, if you look right up in the top right corner, there's one marked in Leven, and that was taking coal from a pit at the back of the town down to the harbour, and the line of that is still there today, and the road is called Wagon Road. And in fact, there are wagon roads still named as such in Inverkeithing, in Crossford and in Alloa, and possibly in other places as well. So as you can see, there were little wagonways, nearly all feeding down to shipping. In the Dunfermline area, the Earl of Elgin had a considerable system going, as you can see, from Inverkeithing, round Holbeath, round back of Wellwood and Dunfermline, and down to the Forth at Charleston and Limekilns. And interestingly, this system, parts of it did survive for a very long time, and some were converted into railways. Nearly all these wagonways disappeared as railways came, but some did survive. And here's a picture of a steam locomotive at Charlestown in 1962, just before the branch closed. And you can see the old lime kilns at Limekilns in the background there. Interestingly, the place is called Limekilns, but the kilns tend to be in Charlestown. Also, an odd system was the Fordell Railway, which went from Fordell near Cowdenbeath down to St David's Harbour at Inverkeithing, and in some ways was a modern railway because it did use steam power, but in other ways was very much like old traditional wagonways, and it was never connected to the National Rail Network because the National Rail Network is 4 foot 8.5-inch gauge, and Fordell Railway was 4 foot 6 gauge. So it was never able to be connected, but it did in some ways look quite like a modern railway. Lothian also had wagonways, and as you can see here, there's the Edmonstone Railway, the Pinkie Railway, around Musselburgh, and the most famous one is the Cockenzie line from Tranent down to Prestonpans and Port Seaton. It was a famous wagonway in its day, and it's said to be the first wagonway that was ever featured in a battle, because Sir John Cope ranged his cannon on the railway or the wagonway embankment during the Battle of Prestonpans in 1745. And in fact, it is said that the reference in the old High Johnny Cope song about him ganging to the coals in the morning is a reference to the railway. But I would say that you could decide that for yourself. I'm not sure if that's true. There's a replica of a wagon as used on the Tranent to Cockenzie, and as you can see, it's a fairly substantial piece of kit and would be very useful for carrying coals. Now, up until now, everything I've talked about, particularly in terms of rails, has been wooden rails. But from the 1700 onwards, there was a gradual move from wood towards iron. Now, here's what wooden rails looked like. This was at Lambton D Pit in Northumberland, and as you can see, they're very crude. Sleepers were crude as well. It seems to be junk timber that was used to build them. So they must have spent quite a lot of time pushing wagons back onto the rails, because I'm sure they must have fallen off quite a lot. So the notion of having metal rather than wood was attractive. The other type of rail that was possible is what's called a plate rail, which is an L-shaped rail, and wagons on that did not have a flange because the flange was on the rail. But it turned out that that was not a terribly efficient way of working. It made points quite tricky to operate, and the rail tended to catch dirt and problems like that. So putting it as an edge rail so that things like dirt and fell off was a better plan. But this Little Eaton gangway, which is in Nottinghamshire, was in operation up until the First World War. The first type of rails were cast iron, and here's a picture from a book called The Coal Viewer, and people could see a whole range of cast iron rails that they could buy. But cast iron has many good features, but it can be brittle, and it's not the most ideal material to use for rails. So wrought iron was a better bet, and here's some pictures of real wrought iron rails as kept in the Science Museum. Now, they're only about 15 feet long at the most, and they're on stone blocks. So riding on a train with blocks, with rails like that must have been pretty uncomfortable. But they were quite strong, and they did last and work better than cast iron ones. And in an interesting and unusual example of technological honesty, George Stephenson, when he started building railways, used wrought iron and recommended that for his railways. And this is despite the fact he was a shareholder in a company making cast iron rails, and that made him very unpopular with his fellow shareholders. But he was right. In the long run, it has to be wrought iron rather than cast iron, because cast iron would fail far too often. Took a while for them to figure out what the best rail profile would be, and as you can see, there's all sorts of ideas there, 1798, 1811, 1813, but eventually it did settle to being what are either called bullhead or flat bottom rails, and that's what modern track is made of, and it's nearly always flat bottom nowadays. Bullhead was originally made with both heads identically shaped, and the idea was that having used one, you could turn it over, but that didn't work because the side that had been underneath was quite badly damaged usually. To finish the thing about wooden railways and iron railways, I've included this picture because in some ways I think this is one of the most interesting pictures in the the whole show. Now, I'll read it what it says. These are tree trunks used by the Germans in the autumn of 1942 to make a wooden rail track for gun-carrying trolleys, supplies and troops in the Volkhov front between Leningrad and Lake Ilmen. The vehicles are mounted on wheel rims, giving the effect of pulley wheels, and the arrangement is reminiscent of medieval mining railway practice. So what they did was they found that it was impossible to use tired vehicles on the roads or what passed for roads in that area. So they took the tires off, put down trees and ran the trains, as it were, up and down on them. And the fascinating thing to me about this picture, apart from its subject, is that this was taken, according to the note, in the autumn of 1942, presumably by a German. Now, I found this picture in a book called The Evolution of Railways, and that book was published in London in 1943. And I'm at a loss as to how a picture taken by a German in the autumn of 1942 could have found its way to London and into a book. And I sometimes wonder if there may have been a secret society of railway enthusiasts that passed such things around and ignored national borders and whose side you were on and so on. But it's a fascinating picture, and it illustrates something that certainly until I'd seen this, I would not have believed possible. Now, coming to steam power. Now, a couple of spoilers here, perhaps, not hopefully too much of a spoiler. James Watt did not invent the steam engine by watching a kettle boiling on his granny's hob. And secondly, the rocket was not the first steam locomotive ever built. There were at least 50 odd built before it. So what we'll have a look at firstly is steam power, not on the railways, because it took 100 years between steam power coming and it being able to go on rail. However, you can go back a lot further than that. This is an Aeolopile. This is a replica made by a chap called Hero of Alexandria about 2000 years BC. And what happened was that the semicircular disc at the bottom was filled with water and heated. Steam rose up the pipes leading up from that and into the circular machine at the top. And by the steam issuing from the two vents, it caused the aeropile to spin round and generate power. And as I say, that was 2000 years ago or more. And nobody could actually figure out a use for it. So it's a lovely object, and this is a beautiful replica, but it does show that steam was in people's minds a very long time ago. Now, this is a replica of the first type of steam engine. Now, this was built by a Cornishman called Thomas Newcomen, and it was built around about 1690 odd. He called it a fire engine. He wouldn't have recognized the term steam engine. It was called a fire engine. The large vertical cylinder that you can see is in fact a cylinder. It has a pump, a piston in it, which is open at the top, and the piston rod goes up and links to a balance beam, and the balance beam has a pump at the other end, and it was used for pumping water out of mines. It was very slow and crude. And how it worked was that there is a small boiler right at the bottom of the picture. Steam at a few pounds per square inch was introduced below the cylinder, below the piston in the cylinder, and the cylinder was then sprayed with water. That caused the steam inside to condense, and as you will know, steam, when it condenses, expands, and that drove the piston and therefore drove the balance beam and made the pump operate. It was very slow, maybe 1 or 2 strokes a minute. It was very crude and wasteful, but it actually worked. And I think it effectively made mining in places like Cornwall feasible. And a lot of the mining building remains that you see in Cornwall today would at one time have had Newcomen type engines in them. Now, enter James Watt. Now, as I say, James Watt did not invent the steam engine, but he worked with his father in Glasgow in a business making and selling equipment for engineers. And he also worked as a scientific instrument maker for Glasgow University. And for some reason at the university, he was asked to make a working replica of a Newcomen engine. And he did so. And in doing so, he realized the main fault about it was that the cylinder had to be heated and cooled every time. So what Watt did was he invented a separate condenser so that it would be condensed steam ready to expand that was injected into the piston, and therefore the whole system became much more efficient. And by the middle second half, shall we say, of the 18th century, Watt engines were what powered the Industrial Revolution. And he also devised with his partner Boulton other ways of taking the power away from the engine, not just using it as to drive a balance beam. And this was the machine for the second half of the 18th century. But it was still far too big and cumbersome to put on rails. And people realized that if you wanted to put it on rails, you would have to make things smaller. And to make things smaller, you would need to consider having the boiler smaller, but operating at a much higher boiler pressure. Now, Watt was dead against this, and his patents effectively prevented anybody from doing anything about them. In some ways, you have a lot of sympathy for Watt, at least I do, because the techniques of boiler making in the 18th century were probably fairly crude. And the idea of making effectively a pressure vessel that could stand a pressure of, say, 50 or 60 pounds per square inch was quite something. And what natural conservatism made him shy away from that. But eventually the patents ran out in the late 1790s and action could be taken again. And again, the action goes back to Cornwall because a chap called Richard Trevithick, he was a great enthusiast for strong steam, and he built such a machine. But actually before that, I'll show you briefly this machine. This was a machine built in France in the 1770s, and it's called the Farnier à Vapeur, and it was built to haul artillery using steam from the small boiler that you can see on the right-hand side. It could do 1 mile an hour, and it was said to be uncontrollable. But nevertheless, it was an attempt, and it's still visible today in the Musée des Arts et des Métiers in Paris, and it's well worth a look if you're ever in Paris. Anyway, back to Trevithick. This is a replica of his first attempt. This is his Puffing Devil, and this was actually a road locomotive rather than a railed one. Now, Trevithick and his team built this and drove it successfully, as it were, around Redruth and Camborne around 1801. But operating a machine like this is quite a thirsty business, so they stopped outside or parked the Puffing Devil outside an inn and went in to refresh themselves, and while they were there, it blew up. Nevertheless, it did prove to some extent that these sorts of things could be made to work. Now, this is an illustration of the Coalbrookdale locomotive, which some people believe, may be the first locomotive ever built for rail. It was certainly designed, but there's very little proof that it was ever actually put into production. However, by 1804, he had built what was called the Penydarren locomotive, and this is a replica of it. And this locomotive was built to win a bet between two South Wales ironmasters as to whether the machine could haul a train of coals over a railway line at Penydarren, or a tramway really, at Penydarren near Merthyr Tydfil. And the locomotive did successfully do that, but was not successful otherwise because it broke the track. It was too heavy. So it is thought that what happened was the wheels were taken off it and it became used as a stationary locomotive. After that, there was a bit of a gap. There was not very much happened for the next 8-10 years until something perhaps from left field came in, because the price of horse fodder in Britain soared. And it soared because the British Army was fighting in the Peninsula, and they had a policy of supplying horse fodder by paying for it rather than taking it from the local peasantry, which is how the French operated. So the demand for horse fodder increased vastly, and in mining areas, people started to think again about what's the possibility of using a steam locomotive rather than a horse. And that led to this. This is Hedley's Puffing Billy of 1812, and this is in the Science Museum in London, and it's the oldest steam locomotive in the world. And it has a very slightly younger brother, sister, call it what you like, called Wylam Dilly. And Wylam Dilly is in the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh, so you may well have seen that. Now, these engines worked at Wylam Colliery on Tyneside for around about 50 years, so not really in original condition, but they were retired in the 1860s and preserved, so they really are very important. Here's a picture inside the boiler of Wylam Dilly. There is one simple flue going back and forth heating the water, and as you can see, the boiler is fairly crudely constructed. I think it would be a brave man that would have driven a machine like this, but it did work. However, people weren't absolutely certain that a smooth rail and a smooth wheel would give enough traction, so a chap called Blenkinsop in Leeds built this type of locomotive, whereas the central wheel is toothed like a cog machine, and that drove itself along the track, and it worked perfectly well. And of course, in places like Switzerland, there are plenty of rack railways nowadays that use broadly the same sort of principles. Basically, this is an aquatint of 1814. It's actually up a series of Yorkshire costumes, and this is supposed to be the collier going to his work, which must be on a Monday morning because he's in pretty clean shape. But you can see Salamanca behind him pulling a train of coal wagons. In Scotland, the Duke of Portland built the first railway between Kilmarnock and Troon and bought a locomotive to run on it, which was too heavy, it broke the track. So he sold it to his friend, the Earl of Elgin, who brought it over to Fife and used it here, but it was too heavy here as well, and it broke the track. However, the Duke did have a beautiful gold model of it presented to him, and here's an illustration of that, and it's still in existence, even if the locomotive itself is not. So, the final thing is the battle for the locomotive. I mean, we think nowadays that locomotives and so on are the obvious way to do things, but it wasn't quite so obvious how it would work if you go back 200 years. For a start, there was things like rope haulage. The idea would be there would be stationary engines that would pull trains along, and this is actually a shot of one still using that system on the Bowes Railway in County Durham, and these systems lasted until the 1970s. So in areas where speed was not of an essence, and sometimes they could be self-acting, that one rake of coaches would pull the other one up and down, then it was well worth considering. But it would never really have worked for the type of service that Liverpool and Manchester, for example, was planning. Just that, and that's despite the fact that there was quite a strong group on the board of the Liverpool and Manchester who did believe that stationary engine rope haulage was the answer. Even then, somebody thought, well, why don't we have a walking locomotive? And this is a drawing of one which was built or tried to be built in 1813. And as you can see, it's got sort of legs at the front that would pull the machine along. I believe that there's a group trying to rebuild one of these at the moment, and if they succeed, then it would be an amazing piece of equipment to see, but I think we'll not hold our breath on that one. This is a very famous locomotive. This is the Stockton and Darlington #1 locomotion, and this was built by Stephensons and used when the Stockton and Darlington opened. Now, some people say the Stockton and Darlington was the first modern railway, and in some respects it is true, but in most areas it really was not entirely the case, because a lot of the transport was still horse-drawn, and people could use the railway or just by hiring the space. So when the Liverpool and Manchester had got to the point where they were considering what to do, they decided that they should have trials to decide what kind of power would be available and what kind of steam locomotive would be suitable. And I've got pictures here of the contestants. This is one that dropped out very quickly. This was called the Cycloped. And basically it's a horse walking on a geared treadmill, and it worked. And they reappeared 2 or 3 times throughout railway history, but they were for very slow shunting use only. You can't imagine 6 or 7 horses galloping along in one of these and pulling a train at 40, 50, 60 miles an hour. The steam contenders, there are replicas of all of them, and I'll show you them now. This was Perseverance, which was built by the rather unfortunately named Timothy Burstall of Edinburgh, and unfortunately bursting is what it did, so it retired. It retired very quickly. This is a pretty crude replica. I don't think it looked that much like it, but it's the only replica we have of it. This is Novelty, and this is an accurate replica of it. This was the favourite at the time. It's a vertical boiler machine. The vertical boiler's just behind the chap with the top hat on. And this was the favourite of the people because it ran around very neatly and apparently looked splendid. It still does look very, very impressive. George Stephenson, though, said in his Geordie way that he didn't fear it because it got nae goods. And I fear he was right. Vertical boilered steam locomotives did latterly become quite successful, but not really for high-speed work. The Novelty was built by Braithwaite and Ericsson. Braithwaite became a successful railway engineer and built many of the main lines from London into East Anglia. Ericsson was Swedish, and he moved to America, and he is the Ericsson who, 30 years later, built the famous ironclad monitor ships that were used by the Confederacy in the Civil War battles. So there's quite a funny link there between America and Sweden and Rainhill near Liverpool. This is Sanspareil. This was built by Timothy Hackworth, who was the locomotive engineer to the Stockton and Darlington Railway, but he built this on his own bat, and it worked quite well, but the cylinders failed, and unfortunately the cylinders had been cast for him by the Stephensons because they were the only people who had the ability to cast this type of cylinder, and the cylinder they cast for him was faulty. It was never proved that it was done deliberately, and it probably wasn't, but it did mean that Sanspareil had to drop out. And here's Rocket, the winner. As I say, some people think the first locomotive ever built, but actually around about the 50th, 55th, something like that. This is a replica of it. There are several replicas around, and this one's in the National Railway Museum in York, and you can see Mallard behind it. So Rocket was built by the Stephensons. It had a multi-tubular boiler, which was a great advance because it meant that the heating surface available for the water was much increased, and therefore it was much more efficient. But in terms of design, to be honest, it was a bit of a dead end. The locomotive was bought by the Liverpool and Manchester Railway afterwards, and in fact 4 or 5 other Rocket type were bought as well, but they were all retired within a few years. The parallels between this and, say, the early years of computers, how development was so quick that things were obsolete within a very short time. Rocket, however, did survive. It was sold to the Earl of Carlisle, who used it in his colliery at Brampton in Northumberland, Cumberland rather, and did so until the early 60s, when a much altered and battered rocket was presented to the Science Museum, and it's still there today, and that one is in fact the original. So rocket proved that steam would work, and therefore the modern railway as we know it with steam power became the norm, and did so really very quickly. And as I've said earlier, rocket itself became very much obsolete, an obsolete design within a very short time, because by the end of 1830, the Stevens had produced this type of locomotive. This is again a replica. It's called the Planet, and it varies or differs from the rocket in many, many ways. For a start, the cylinders, which were behind the driving wheel at a 45-degree angle in the rocket, are now side by side, horizontally underneath the smoke box at the front of the locomotive, and they drive the driving wheel by a crank axle. Now that meant that the ride was much more steady, because with the rocket type, the shouldering action of the locomotive was very awkward and transmitted itself to the train. This type of design was much better ride given, but the crank axle was always a definite source of weakness, because actually making such a thing in the 1830s was really very high tech. So as you can see, it has a very strong frame that hopefully would hold the thing together. It's got multi-tubular boiler, and basically about 90-95% of all steam locomotives that have been built in the world have this as their real direct ancestor. And this finally proved that the steam railway could work. And to finish, we'll pop forward to 1960, and this is Evening Star. This is the last steam locomotive built for British Railways. A 210 locomotive, massive by comparison to Planet, but really not much more than a greatly expanded version of the Planet. And interestingly, built or designed for a 40-year lifespan, this locomotive actually only worked for 40 years and was then replaced by diesels. So I've now come to the end of my talk, and I'll sign off there. But if anybody wants to contact me, give me more information, corrections, anything like that, I'm very much open to that. Just get in touch with me by email. My email address is there. So thank you very much for listening to me. I hope you found it of some interest, and I hope my throat managed to stay okay as well. Thank you.
Okay, John, thank you very much for that. Very interesting talk, taking us a big span of history, in fact. Yeah, all the way back to 2000 BC, I think you said.
Yeah.
Quite a long way back, and I suppose it just goes to show that, as with other things, sometimes ideas or principles have been established at some point, but like you said, with that example, no one could think of a particular use at the time, and it's only later one comes along and thinks, I could utilize that. And
yes, exactly.
Yeah. So we'll see if there's any questions pop up here. I wondered, because I was aware of Charleston and the lime kilns. Are there any sort of wagonways or anything like that, or where would the closest be? Is it still possible to see any at all?
You can see traces of them in different sorts of places, but it's quite hard to pick them out. For example, if you take the train from, well, say Dalgety Bay down to Inverkeithing, if you look north as you pass Hill End, the little village of Hill End, you can actually see the trace of the track of a of a wagonway coming down the hill. And you can trace bits of, say, the Fordell Railway. There's quite a lot of areas where you can at least work out where the wagonway must have been. You've got to use a bit of imagination at times. Some places have been built over completely. I mean, as I said, Wagon Road in Leven is named for that, as is, for example, Wagon Road in Crossford. That's the road that takes you from, the traffic lights in the centre of Crossford down to the A985. So that there are signs there, but you've got to go and look for them.
And is there anything like that that's been set up in a sort of heritage museum or a heritage kind of context anywhere in the UK that you know of?
There's quite a lot of things like that at Beamish Museum. In the north of England Open Air Museum has got some. I think the Black Country probably does a bit as well, although they have more really on the canal side of things. There's no preserved wagonways in quite the same way as the preserved railways, but there are areas where, these replica locomotives that we saw for the Rainhill trials, they very often work at places like Beamish and so on.
Mm-hmm. And there was one reference that you had there where there was archaeological work and it uncovered a wooden rail system. Did that just get filled in again, or is that still available? Is that still visible?
Still visible, as far as I know. Yes, because although it isn't Roman, it's said to be the most important find. I don't really know how much was known about that site beforehand. I mean, the archaeologists, as I say, thought that we're digging for Roman remains, and don't seem to have found any. But they may be just dug in the wrong place. Wow. But even 200 years, these things have been buried like that, and it's quite incredible that they can still be uncovered.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What I did notice on that as well, and this is maybe a naive question, but there seemed to be quite a lot of sleepers. And considering it was sort of wooden rails, I would have thought that they didn't need so many, that the gap between sleepers could have been reasonably large. But any thoughts on that, John?
Well, I think they did sometimes just use any sort of odd bits of timber. So there was a period where, as wagon weights increased, that they did have problems, and there was a time when they started putting iron and an iron plate on top of the wooden rail in certain areas. If there was heavy wear or anything like that. But I think they accepted a much greater likelihood of things going wrong and having to be repaired than we would expect today. Yeah. These things can't have operated perfectly because they weren't built perfectly. Mm-hmm.
And of course, as you mentioned as well, there's no great speed involved, so it's not such an issue if something doesn't if it breaks. Yes, it's still going to be a bit of a menace, but
yes,
exactly a disaster.
But they did kill people, though. I mean, it's the famous story about William Huskisson getting run down on the opening day of the Liverpool in Manchester. People say, that was the first person, killed by a railway. But in fact, there was dozens of people being killed by them beforehand.
Yeah, I suppose it's not the sort of thing you would want to be too close to, certainly.
No.
I think that kind of leads on to another question, really. The fact that it was just wooden rails, and presumably, well, no matter what the wagon was like, before the concept of flanges, how on earth did they actually keep anything on these rails?
Well, exactly. As I say, sometimes they did try the trick of having the flange on the rail rather than on the wheel. I think it gradually emerged that giving some sort of shape to the wheel so that it would hold on the rail better. But I mean, even nowadays, the flange is only supposed to be there just in case. I mean, it doesn't. You hear it squealing sometimes when you go around corners, but normally the flange does not touch the rail. But yes, again, it must have fallen. They must have fallen off frequently, and they say that particularly in the mines, they pushed them at tremendous speeds for as hard as they could go, because time was money, and when you look at what the track work was like, you wonder how they ever stayed on.
Well, yeah. Yeah, and I mean, and perhaps worse so with horses. I don't know whether that would make it better or worse to try and keep them on the track.
It's difficult to know. In some cases, it might be better. Horses could be trained to do things. They could be trained to walk along the track and not, and walk between sleepers and so on. I don't know if you've heard of dandy carts.
No, I don't think so.
Dandy cart was a sort of wagon that was sort of like a horse stall, and generally had a manger in it, and horses would be uncoupled when the train was going down a hill. The horse would be uncoupled, wait till the train would pass, and it would jump onto the dandy wagon and have a feed while the train was going down the hill. It's just incredible.
Yeah,
it was the horse knows the way type of thing. Horses were very intelligent for that type of work. Yeah.
I mean, is there? I mean, just in thinking about flanges, I suppose it varied across Europe. But was there a point where that sort of became an established thing to have a flange?
I would have said by the early 19th century, it was pretty definite. The plateway, the L-shaped plateway, did exist, as we can see, right until the 20th century, but that was just obsolete, really. They originally had thought that would be a good idea because you just used a normal wheel. They did find that it was quite hard to keep the L shape clear of rubbish and get you a good adhesion. And as I said in the talk, actually doing a set of points that you could run through at speed is much harder with an L shape than it would be with the edge rail that we use today.
Yeah. And in terms of the gauge, I take it that was just one of these evolution things, that it was just somehow decided that a certain size would become a standard.
Yeah. The George Stephenson used the Colcart gauge that was in use in Northumberland. The wee railways and wagonways and so on that he built before he started to build the Stockton and Darlington and the Liverpool and Manchester had been built to that gauge, and he realised really very early, firstly, that the gauge size in a way didn't matter, but what it needed be was all the same, because he said, these railways are hundreds of miles apart, but they'll be joined eventually, and it therefore makes sense to build them to a standard gauge so that they can be joined.
And did the UK sort of lead the way in that, and Europe adopted, or was it the other way around? Generally,
it was the UK that led the way, and same in America. I mean, it was the British engineers that supplied the first locomotives for America and so on, in that sort of area. Same as the British built most of the railways in France and quite a lot of the continent. But the advantage that other countries had was not so much in the rail gauge, but in the fact that they could, in Britain, you have all these, you were building railways through existing towns and so on. So you had bridges and tunnels and things like that, and they had to be smaller than they could, say in America, they didn't bother about that. You could build them 3 or 4 feet higher than we could.
Yeah.
On the other hand, in Britain, we have platforms where you can step onto a train. Most of the world, you have to climb up onto the train from a platform that's on the ground or very close to the ground, if you think about it.
Hmm. And is that just a sort of cultural thing?
Yeah, I think so. I think so.
Yeah.
It was a disadvantage for the British because their steam locomotives were restricted by their width, their cylinder width, because of the platform height. If you have no platform, you've got a good bit more width to play with. Mhm.
That makes sense. Yeah.
But it's the problems of it being the pioneer. You know, you set up standards, and to some extent, you've got to live with them.
So, in terms of the closest sort of wagon way to Markinch, where would that be, if that's even possible to answer? That's a good question that's been posed here.
I'll have a wee look.
Again, I suppose it's going to be contingent on what that means, whether it's how visible it is, or it's just, as you say, a kind of an outline that's still there.
Probably the one at Leven that I mentioned would be the nearest one. I mean, there was one or two along the coast at Burnt Island and so on, but there was nothing much inland in Fife. So it would be Leven would be your nearest one.
Yeah. But you mentioned, where was the one you said was still kind of visible?
Well, some of the ones around the Dunfermline area, sort of near Hill End, you can see the track of it going down the hillside. I don't know if you can walk it or not, but
there was another question that's come in. Obviously, there was a lime kilns up the East Lomond. Was there any kind of trackway to get the coal up, or indeed the product down?
Not up East Lomond, as far as I know. There were tracks up at Cults. The line works up at Cults and Burnturk and that sort of area. There was a railway system there. The little village you go through on the Cooper Road with. It's got a pub and it's got what was a maltings that's now lived in. The railway used to run along the side of the road there and then went up into Cult. And there were canals up at Cults as well for moving stuff around.
Canals, yeah?
Yeah.
Oh. That's
there was actually, if you like canal, there was a canal built in 1483 by Sir Andrew Wood, who was the Lord High Admiral of Scotland, and he lived in Largo House, Upper Largo, and he built a canal from his house to the church so he could sail to church on a Sunday.
Now, I think I had heard that, but I hadn't heard about one up at Cults.
The Cults ones they were in operation from about 1800 to about 1830. And they were just short. It was just to move, goods around on the site. They had several short canals.
Yeah, because that's because Cults is quite an elevated site.
Oh yes, I know. Yes, I'm not sure where they got the water from. Yeah.
Yeah. So here's another question, John. When was the first parliamentary act that enabled a railway to cross private land?
The first parliamentary act is generally said to be the Middleton Railway Act of 1758. That was in south of Leeds. So it was a colliery line in the south side of Leeds. It's still actually there. It's still a preserved railway. Now that's generally regarded as the first. I don't know if it crossed private land, but it's almost certain that it would have done, because otherwise there were certain railways that were built without Parliamentary Act because they didn't cross private land or anything like that. There was also the wayleave system was in use quite a lot. That if you owned the land, you would allow the railway or the wagonway to be built across it and charge them rent. And these sort of wayleave things still exist. You know, that if you want our railway down at Kirtland, the electricity company wanted to put a cable through our land, and they pay us wayleave. Okay. Not very much, you know. It's just a gesture, but that sort of thing was more common. But eventually, private acts needed to be done for most railways, and it was a very expensive way of funding them. But the Middleton is usually regarded as the first, 1758.
Okay, so see if there's any other questions come in. Well, that's been a whole hour now anyway.
Aye.
So we'll see if any come in. We'll just give it a minute or so.
Okay.
But yeah, you displayed your email address, and if people have got any questions, they could always contact you directly or through the Heritage Group.
Aye.
Either by Facebook, website, whatever. So if anything crops up, I'll let you know.
Okay.
But I just want to thank you very much again, John, for a most interesting talk. I've certainly learned a lot, and hadn't really given much consideration, I must say, to railways before railways. I always think in terms of steel, iron rails, you know, and steam, kind of from that point onwards. So I think we'll just end the broadcast there. If you just hang on, John, we'll just have a wee word afterwards. But doesn't seem to be any more questions. So I'll just thank you again and thank everyone for watching. And this is our last talk of this current season. We'll have a little summer break. We'll be back in September. The programme has been put together, or certainly largely put together. And we'll certainly maybe give teasers over the summer time. So again, I'm sure it'll be another round of interesting talks. So good night, everyone, and enjoy your summer.
Thank you.
Bye for now.